So just a couple of words also about some of the factors or elements of the rule of law crisis, which were on one of the other slides. So, for example, 63% of countries experiencing a decline in fundamental rights. This is quite severe. These rights we're talking about: equal treatment, the absence of discrimination, due process, rights of the accused, the right to a fair trial, freedom of belief and religion, freedom of assembly and association. On my side of the chart, 57% of countries experiencing a decline in constraints on government power. Of course, the check of an independent judiciary, being able to curb the excesses of government powers when those are overstepped. And then finally, this decline in civil justice. I just want to mention that one because I think it sounds very technical, but it's really the thing that matters often in people's daily lives. Can you get your child registered for school? Can you ensure that you're not evicted unfairly from your home? So we're talking about declines in the way that people are experiencing justice on a daily basis. Okay, so over to some questions. So I'd love to start with you, Anne, and I want to particularly ask you, can you talk a little bit about what's driving this decline? What is the connection between the decline in the rule of law and rising autocratization?
So first of all, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always wonderful to be in a room with people who care about these issues and who work on them, because I do think they're pretty central to everything that's happening around the world right now. Let me start by saying that the decline in the rule of law is the point. So the reason why we have the rise in authoritarianism is that authoritarian populists and authoritarians, full authoritarians, their main goal, the goal of their political program, is the destruction of the rule of law. Why? Because the rule of law helps them eliminate checks and balances, restrictions, transparency, accountability, anything that would constrain them, whether it would constrain them in their exercise of power or in their ability to keep power or in their ability to earn money or steal money while they're in power. The rule of law is actually their main object. And so if you look around the world, both at sitting authoritarian governments in Russia and China and at autocratic populists who are seeking to change their political systems, you see immediately the same problem. In failing or struggling democracies, of which we now have to include the United States, you'll hear a constant repetitive series of attacks on judges. So you've heard President Trump attack individual judges or judges as a whole. You will see you can hear the government or the leaders sometimes deliberately breaking the law as a way of, we will break the law first, and then we will see whether you are able to hold us to account. We saw that here in the previous government. We've seen it in Turkey and elsewhere. So their goal is to undermine the rule of law, to undermine the court system as a way of accruing power to themselves. And their rhetoric is designed to do that, and sometimes their actions and politics are also designed to do that. What is their goal? Their goal is replacing the rule of law with rule by law, meaning that the law is what the leader says it is. And that's, of course, that's the opposite. And that is the system that it entails in Russia, for example, or in China, or in North Korea, or indeed in Saudi Arabia. If you go to court and you have a political case, and the case is of interest to people in power, then you will not be judged according to the Constitution or to the written law. You will be judged according to how people in power want you to be judged. I should say there's a broad spectrum. It's not as if countries are good and bad, or they conform or don't conform to the rule of law. Even within the EU, there's a pretty broad range. Every time I go to Spain, people start talking to me about problems with the court system there. You hear about it in Italy. It's not as if the only problem is Poland or Hungary. There's a spectrum. It's a constant argument it's almost always in the interests of some politicians to be seeking to undermine the system, and so that's why. That's why it's declining, and of course it's part of. You just heard Maria Ressa talking about the nature of social media and of public conversation and debate. This is very deeply connected to deeper changes in our society. So if there is no shared truth, if there is no agreement even on what we all should be talking about at the same time, if we don't have a shared public space, then of course it makes it more difficult to have rule of law, which is by definition a shared public space. We all agree on what the law is. We can argue about how it should be applied, but we have a shared understanding of what our legal system is supposed to be. If we don't have that anymore, if some people think our legal system is corrupt or illegitimate or doesn't count, then we will not be able to enforce the rule of law. So the changes are quite deep. They're being pushed and promoted by some in politics, and they are connected to the loss of shared reality.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That's a very thoughtful and thought-provoking, I think, set of issues for us to think about. So if those are some of the reasons that you see autocracy rising and rule of law declining, and as you've described, there's a causal relationship there and also an intentional connection, what can we do, Kevin, to reverse the trajectory?
Well, thank you very much for having me here. It's wonderful to be back at the World Justice Forum, and let me say that it's also an honor to share the stage with my fellow panelists. I declare publicly my admiration for Anne's writing on all these things. That is among the most lucid out there. Meg, that's the question, isn't it?
Yes.
And it's one that doesn't have a straight answer. Because when it comes to stemming the tide of backsliding, in full honesty, we seem to be at a loss as to what to do. I would say that there are different levels to this answer. There's one level at which you have, in certain countries, a set of institutions that are meant to check on the exercise of power, particularly executive power, that continue to play a role, and that, as Anne was saying, are in the crosshairs of any authoritarian or would-be authoritarian leaders. Those institutions have expanded over the past, I would say, 2 or 3 decades. I mean, we used to have the usual checks and balances, parliament as a check to executive power, judiciaries. Now we have a broader set of actors. We have the whole fourth branch, so-called fourth branch institutions, ombuds institutions, anti-corruption commissions, in some cases, very prominent ones, electoral authorities that play that role. So, and of course we have civil society, we have the free press. One key thing when we think about what we need to do is when we start seeing the first signs of encroachment on the autonomy and the ability of these institutions to act, of any of these institutions, it's crucial that those institutions, those different actors, start acting in a concerted way. And this is something that we've seen in a number of cases. I mean, I'll cite a couple of examples that rapidly come to mind. A few years back, it was the collaboration between the press, the free press, civil society, that made possible that a referendum was called to protect the autonomy of the public broadcaster in Slovenia. In some cases, like Malaysia, is the collaboration between the free press, civil society, and the Anti-Corruption Commission that holds the executive to account. So that cross-institutional collaboration is of the essence. That's one level. Then you have a second level, which is that I have to think that in virtually every case that we know where the tide of backsliding has been stopped, at least for a time, that runs through key elections. Key elections that managed to stop the tide. I mean, the cases, I would say Poland, at least, you know, not the last election, but the previous one. Brazil, Guatemala, you might include in that category Senegal, Zambia. It always happens through a key election. The practical implication of this being, and we can elaborate on that in the course of this conversation, that protecting the integrity of elections is truly of the essence, because the ultimate check on power is, in a democracy, is elections. Elections that are free and fair. And then at an even higher level of abstraction, if you will, I have to think, and again, we can elaborate on this in the course of this conversation, highly unequal societies. And the world as a whole is becoming an incredibly unequal place. Highly unequal societies, and this is something that, coming from Latin America as I do, we know very well. Highly unequal societies create enormous distortions for the equal application of the law. So unless and until we take inequality very seriously, it will be very difficult to make sure that the rule of law prevails.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about the institutional piece, which you've mentioned, but I wonder if you would have a little bit more to say about the key institutions that perhaps need to be defended, need to be supported?
Oh, you see that in Anne was alluding to, the different actors that come under fire, under fire coming from authoritarian leaders. We all know who they are. It's independent judiciaries, independent judges, independent journalists, free journalists, civil society, electoral authorities. The order in which they come under fire from incumbents may vary according to the country. In some cases, they go after the electoral authority first. Case of Nicaragua, for example. In some cases, they go after independent journalists first. In some cases, they go after judges first. But it's always the same. It is those. It is those that authoritarians try to obliterate in their autonomy and try ultimately to co-opt. The order varies, but it's always the same. It's judiciaries, the free press, civil society, and electoral authorities.
Thank you. And I'm really glad you pointed out the issue of inequality. One thing that I've seen in many, many countries is the populist discourse concerning judges is that they're elite, that they don't actually respond to the needs of the people. And I think it can become it's a vulnerable argument if there are deep inequalities where justice is not felt by large parts of the population. But it's something that I think we need to find ways to counter it very early on. And I think that has to do with reducing inequalities, responding to that problem.
Yep.
Okay, I'd like to talk about some examples. Clare, I wonder if you could talk a bit about lessons that we can learn from countries where we do see walking back of the recession or an increasing of the rule of law again after a time of decline. And I'm thinking here, of course, of Poland.
So thank you very much for this question. Thank you so much for inviting me and for having the Council of Europe on this stage with these other wonderful speakers and in this room with so many people who have dedicated a good part of their lives to this fight, basically. I think we do need to to think of it as a fight, and I think we all need to up our game. I mean, we see in the Council of Europe, with passing elections and with the different political landscape in each country, it really ebbs and flows in terms of human rights and protection of the rule of law. And I think when we see an opportunity, a political opportunity, we really need to jump in there quickly and support the country in question. And, I was very pleased to see on your slide Moldova and Estonia and also, for that matter, Kazakhstan rising up because these are countries that the Council of Europe has been doing a great deal of capacity building because we, as well as standard setting and monitoring, we also do a great deal of capacity building. And I don't really want to talk about Poland, but I wouldn't mind talking about countries like Moldova, in fact, because in Moldova they saw when the Maia Sandu government came in, they saw really a problem with corruption in the courts. I really do think that courts are also really the front line in protecting the rule of law. And so in Moldova, they decided to have a kind of a system of judicial vetting. They brought in international experts to do that, to assist them in the criteria that should be applied, and the methodology. It's a very, very difficult process to go through basically all of your courts. First to set up the body which is going to do it, then to look at all of your courts and screen the judges for any possible corruption. This is also happening at the moment in Ukraine. They're in the midst of this massive judicial reform, which is also poised to do this. While you're doing it, it causes great problems because it really slows up the delivery of justice. As you said, really the way in which citizens most see the kind of the value of the rule of law is if they can, do all the stuff they want to do, and if it takes a very, very long time, then they're going to get discontented. So it's a difficult process. But I think in Moldova it has been successful, and hopefully in Ukraine also. Yeah.
Thank you so much for those examples.
Yeah.
I wondered, maybe taking it to a different region, Kevin, would you like to address an example of perhaps Brazil?
The case of Brazil is very interesting in terms of being able, at least for now, to defend democracy. And let me say that this is what I think is the most basic test that a liberal democracy should pass, which is being able to defend itself. And in this, the contrast between Brazil and the US is very jarring. When Brazil went through the events that took place 3 years ago, it really held people to account, right? In a way that the US was not able to do. And of course, and here we get into a different side to this conversation. The Supreme Court that bore the brunt of that effort to protect the rule of law and democracy in Brazil, and that, in my view, played an absolutely outstanding role under very difficult circumstances. They were accused at different points of being ruthless and of pushing the envelope when it comes to being to holding people to account. And I think this is important because this is a discussion that comes up in other cases. I mean, just before walking into this room, we were having the conversation about Romania. Again, a case in which the Supreme Court has been accused of being ruthless. Well, there are guys on the other side that are not exactly, lilies, right? And that there's an argument to be made in terms of the need for a certain level of ruthlessness if what is at stake is the survival of democracy. And Brazil, I think, is a case that illustrates this in a very powerful way.
So this idea of ruthlessness is one I want to pick up on. It's very interesting, and I think it a little bit touches on what you were saying, Claire, about at certain moments of rupture, there needs to be an extraordinary action, like vetting, for example. How do we know when we get to that point? And how do we conceptualize that under a rule of law regime? Because, of course, the rule of law has to apply even when coming back from a real regression or attack on the rule of law. Do any of you have thoughts on that? And I think you were talking a bit about this, and I'd love to invite you into this.
So I don't think there is any formula, unfortunately. I mean, it's not like you can say at this moment, Democrats need to intervene to protect their system. People have made different judgments and they've been right or wrong at different moments. So the Biden administration, for example, made the judgment based on Joe Biden's personal feeling that a long memory of working in a bipartisan way with other members of the Senate, a long tradition of bipartisanship in American democracy. He was as a result of that, he was very, very reluctant, for example, to indict Donald Trump for January the 6th. And he had very good reasons for that, and I'm sure, and his attorney general supported him in that, and that was why the procedures that. All I'm saying is that there were legitimate legal and political arguments for that long delay, but the result was that it didn't happen. And therefore, Trump was perceived by many millions of Americans to be innocent. And so that's an example, if you will, of one decision. I mean, here I won't talk about Poland because I'm afraid there are probably several dozen people in the room who know more about it than I do, and I'd love to hear from an audience member. But anybody who knows anything about the situation here also knows that there is an ongoing debate and argument about how to reverse the damage done to the judicial system here and whether it should have been harsher or softer, more. And honestly, I've heard arguments from both sides, and I don't have a view. I mean, these are matters of judgment, and I, as I said, be willing to listen to people afterwards say so. Romania is a very, very interesting moment. And it's maybe an example that deserves more time than it's been given. So as those of you, again, I'm sure most of you know, there was an election in Romania, the original presidential election in which a candidate won who was not, Calin Georgescu, and he was not merely controversial because he was actively and openly pro-Russian and probably backed by the Russians. That wasn't actually the issue. The issue was that, according to Romanian law, he had broken the law in his election campaign. So he said that he had not spent any money on the campaign, whereas in fact somebody in his name had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, at least on TikTok and maybe in other places, supporting him. $100,000 or $1 million doesn't sound like very much in the American political context, but in Romania it's a lot. And it was anyway more than so he had lied about his, or been dishonest about how he had conducted the election. And so then the court was faced with a dilemma, which is what to do about it. How do you in a post hoc way make up for the fact that somebody has cheated in the election? And they decided to annul the election. And this was very, very controversial, and maybe even backfired. I mean, it meant that a lot of people, including the Vice President of the United States, accused Romania of seeking to block the far-right candidate for ideological reasons. And the argument goes on. On the other hand, had they not done that, what would have been the result for Romanian rule of law? Well, then everybody would have concluded that it's okay to cheat in elections. Mm-hmm. It's okay to take money from whoever, or hide the money, or hide the payments. And I mean, one of the other things that is unique about social media, actually, is that it allows exactly this kind of cheating. specifically electoral campaign cheating, is facilitated in different ways by social media. And it's something that our courts and our legal systems and our laws on elections haven't really coped with yet either. And so what the Romanian court did was, obviously it was too late. Obviously this violation of the law should have been caught during the campaign. And not after the guy had. This was the first round of the election, not the second round, but not after somebody had won the first round of the election. But maybe better late than never. I'm sure the argument over that will continue. But there comes a point where you have to ask, what are the consequences of not enforcing the law? What are the consequences of not indicting the insurrectionists? What are the consequences of not making sure that people obey the electoral law as it stands? And those consequences are pretty high, as we've seen in other places.
Oh, absolutely. Claire, do you have thoughts on this about kind of when is there an extraordinary moment and when do the actions need to be taken that might be unusual?
Yeah. Actually, I just want to pick up on something that Anne said about, about when is it right to intervene. I also think it's incredibly important just for all democratic actors to really up their communication game and to explain those kind of stories. Because something like this, the Constitutional Court judgment in Romania, or we've been working also with Armenia, which had their Constitutional Court had a very, very difficult judgment to make on their constitution related to the Karabakh region of Azerbaijan, and the sort of displaced population from there, and which was really, there's a lot of misinformation. There was a really polarized kind of social media campaign about it. They did a huge communication effort to really explain clearly. Obviously, it's a very, very long legal judgment, but to try and explain clearly in a way that people could understand. They even kind of really got journalists into a room and really sat them down and explained exactly what the basis of their judgment was. I think it's so important for all, from the local court to the Constitutional Court to national human rights institutions to democratic governments to organisations like the Council of Europe to really, really up our communication game. I think we can't let the populists get all the good narratives. In your book, you really talk about Alexei Navalny. He was a genius at kind of really making the anti-corruption story very enjoyable to watch. All his videos really explaining that link between, they're doing that, and that means that you've got no doctors in your hospitals, and I think all of us can learn from that and really, really up our games in that. Yeah.
This is a really important point, actually. I mean, it's something I've seen repeatedly over the last few years, that there are a lot of institutions that never thought they had to do campaigns. Universities. What do universities do? They teach people, they do research, they find cures for cancer. They do all these things, but they don't have, other than, little newsletters that get sent to the alumni, they don't do public campaigns explaining to the public who they are and what they do. And therefore, the definition of what is a university and how does it work has been defined by the far right, which describes them as elite institutions that do, woke, woke education or woke indoctrination. And universities have been repeatedly caught not being able to explain themselves or with the wrong people in charge. And this is true of universities, it's true of courts, it's true of all kinds of bodies that, as I said, most of them not set up to do communications or never occurred to anybody that they would need to be, need to have that way of speaking, but now really need to learn it.
Oh, really important point. Kevin.
Yeah, can I say something about the communication angle of all this? And I think at some level, the politics of this is very complicated and at some point is very simple. And here's a bit of self-criticism. I increasingly have the impression that the discourse that we disseminate very often about defending democracy and defending the rule of law actually does very little to defend democracy and the rule of law. You know, admonishing people about defending democracy and the rule of law does next to nothing for people that are concerned about more basic things. And this is something that we've seen time and again. This discourse of defending democracy completely failed in Mexico, completely failed in the US, because for the person that is concerned about the personal safety of their family in El Salvador, peddling the notion that we have to defend democracy, it just doesn't cut it. Just doesn't cut it. So it is, I mean, if we really care about stemming the tide of backsliding, it's really, really important that we try to solve the issues that are making people angry about democracy. Just saying, right? That and the cases in which the opposition to populist authoritarianism has been successful is because they have managed to connect their efforts to stem the tide of backsliding with very basic issues that are the real concerns of most people.
Claire, please go ahead.
Sorry, and just to build on your point about inequality, I totally agree with you on that, but I also think, thinking more globally, there really can't be double standards, because I think, you know, there's a perception in the global south that you know, that Europe and that really there's one rule for our allies and one rule for our enemies, and you can see that playing out at the moment a little bit, and I think that's very, very corrosive of the rule of law. There's either the standards or there aren't, and you should apply them to everyone. Yeah.
And you know, just a, you know, a very a footnote to this, and there's also the problem, which is increasingly visible, that the whole spiel about defending democracy is increasingly perceived as defending the establishment.
Yes.
Defending the status quo. So, you know, on the communication issue, we have to be careful about the issues we focus on and the way we frame this. It cannot be seen as defending the establishment, because people are fed up with the establishment.
Right. And I'm glad you mentioned Mexico in this front. So for those of you who maybe haven't been following Mexico carefully, there was a recent very large reform of the judiciary, which involves adopting a constitutional change to make it such that judges are now all elected by the population. And really, there was a very effective campaign by the ruling government to both demonize judges individually, so very individually go after them, name them, shame them in a variety of quite upsetting ways, but then also to frame judges, as I said before, as elite and judicial independence as being about the individual judge, not about a protection of citizens' rights, a protection of the rule of law. And I really feel like we see that happening in the US right now as well, in a very similar way. I wonder here can we talk a little bit about what those countervailing forces are? You talked about institutional ones. What about this messaging question, and also maybe the role of social movements? Like, what are the additional things that need to come into play to really start to change that discussion and change the playing field? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, this is you're asking a question that's not really about the rule of law. You're asking a question that's about how to reach and motivate people in an era of fragmented social media, when actually what you need is a campaign on TikTok, a campaign on YouTube, a campaign on X, a campaign on, in 9 different ways. And you need to be thinking about how to reach people where they are. And, we're used to, again, the campaigns are something that is done only during election periods, for a few months, but actually now campaigns are nonstop. And so there's a thing, until we get the reform of social media that Maria Ressa described, everybody needs to be campaigning all the time.
Yeah.
And really thinking differently about thinking about not just about what message you want to put out, but which audiences are you trying to reach and how are you trying to reach them? So who will be interested in hearing about this, in this way or in a different way or in another way? So thinking really in that way is how democratic politicians, but maybe also civil society actors, also others who care about how these questions are being argued need to be part of that all the time. And the far right has been doing this for 2 decades.
It's true. Yeah.
They've been thinking, certainly since 2015, maybe 1 decade, but certainly since 2015, they've been thinking about the different ways to reach people through entertainment, through weightlifting podcasts, through health and wellness podcasts, through the many different ways in which people get information, and they've been active in that way. Beginning to unpick that and think, how would you work in those spheres, on the other side of politics is what is just beginning now.
Right.
Can I just say something about this notion of a permanent campaigning? I think this is an issue that is particularly relevant to mention here in Poland. We tend to think about this as the old revolutionary anthem, La Internacional es la lucha final, is the final struggle. I mean, there's no final struggle. And that's exactly what we've seen here in Poland. I mean, there's no such a thing as a turning point. One of the things that we need to accept, whether we like it or not, is that this assault on democracy, this assault on the rule of law, the assault coming from a populist authoritarianism is here to stay. Is here to stay. So if you're lucky, and you might not be lucky, but if you're lucky, this is a case of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But you may not be lucky. So the notion that, you manage to rally all the democratic forces, together, and that you fight a wonderful campaign and you win an election, and that's that, well, we know better now.
Yeah.
We know better that this is a protracted struggle that forces those that are committed to democracy and the rule of law to be in a permanent campaign mode.
Very well said. Thank you. And happily, I do feel like we have some really wonderful examples happening this week of that kind of messaging, of really trying to move our messaging into cultural spaces and to really get it outside of just this kind of panel, but take it outside of there. I want to ask about the role of supranational, so really regional institutions here. Some scholars look to regional institutions as absolutely crucial for some of these examples. I think, the European system has been very active in defending democracy in a variety of ways. What is your view, each of you, on how important that kind of institutional setup is?
Well, should I start? Because obviously I'm going to say
Please
extremely
do, exactly.
important. But I seriously do think it is extremely important because, and I think it's extremely important for democratic governments in Europe to really cherish it and uphold it. And no organisation, no treaty, no court is perfect. But I do think if there's ways and ways of criticising them, there's ways and ways of reforming it. I think the way to to approach disagreements is really in a multilateral way, and to be discussing it and to be using diplomacy. And I really do insist on this double standard point, because I think you need to start from a position of strength if you want to call out other countries for what they're doing in terms of breaking human rights, breaching human rights. Then you really have to be yourself, for talking about the Council of Europe, implementing the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. And so I think that's really important. I do think that these kind of, for the Council of Europe anyway, it's been very flexible at looking at new challenges as well. We haven't mentioned AI, but we have this Council of Europe has a new framework convention on AI, which is actually a global convention. And if you look at an institution like the Council of Europe, it now has about 200 different treaties. You can almost, if you look at the chronology of those, you can just see what people were concerned about at the time and how that has evolved. And I really do strongly believe in multilateralism as a way of, safeguarding the values that we hold dear. Yeah.
I do think that it can be, multilateral institutions can be a very powerful countervailing force. It's been uneven in practice, and I can think of good and less good examples. I happen to think that, for example, the role that the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights has played historically in Latin America has been very important in upholding some key democratic values and human rights writ large. We can have a long conversation about the EU, about whether the EU has been effective in upholding the rule of law in cases where it's been challenged. Africa has some good examples, or used to have some good examples. ECOWAS was a good example. Now ECOWAS is in a shambles. And then in Asia, you have, the ASEAN has done nothing when it comes to Myanmar, as glaring a case as Myanmar. So it's been very, very uneven. The problem, of course, with all this, even if we may agree in principle that the multilateral level has an important role to play, is that multilateralism as such is in a terrible crisis, right? If democracy and the rule of law are under assault, the assault on multilateralism that we are seeing playing out before our eyes is an assault on asteroids. So I don't know how effective that will be as a countervailing force going forward, given the trends that we're seeing.
Look, multilateral institutions they only have power and they only have influence if the people who belong to them give them that power and influence. They don't exist in a space where they don't have their own judges, and they don't have their own armies, and they don't have their own, legitimacy by themselves. It's only through the, through the agreement of the people who are part of them. And for that reason, a lot of the regional ones work a little better. The EU works better because it has some real power, it has some real ability to, it can make real decisions about money, for example. So they were able to hold back funding, both for Hungary as well as Poland, for rule of law violations, which there's no other, and they were able to do that because both Poland and Hungary want to be part of the EU for other reasons, and in fact their membership is popular. When the farther you go up the scale, and I'm afraid this includes the UN, you have less and less buy-in, you have less and less influence. whether the UN is now anything, at the level of certainly at the level of the Security Council, is now anything more than just a kind of remaining post-war aspiration. I'm not sure. It's the weakness. This is off our topic a little bit, but the weakening of the Security Council has meant that it's completely powerless to do anything at all about the war in Ukraine, or really, frankly, the war in the Middle East. Nobody, even if you look back at Iraq, the Iraq invasion in 2003, there was consultation with the UN, and there were UN mandates and agreements that were used by the Bush administration as a part of their argument for the invasion. This now, nobody bothers. It's not. It didn't even come up. Trump, of course, also didn't consult with Congress, and he didn't consult with the American public before making the decision to bomb Iran, a couple of days ago. And that represents that 20 years represents a big shift, and I think. One doesn't want to, dismiss the usefulness of there are many international organizations that still function and that have roles and so on. But I think we need to acknowledge that whatever bound people to them, is gone or over, and we need to begin thinking about what's going to replace them.
Indeed.
Very interesting. And I think also a real challenge for us, right? To really think through that looking glass.
I've written a little bit about this, and I've tried to think about it, but it's, people are, the institutions exist, people have investment in them, people have jobs there, people want them to work in a certain way, people have a UN ambassador, or they have an ambassador to, UNESCO, whatever, and they have they're part, there's a bureaucracy that keeps them going, but really, if we want to think about how do we, for example, even how does the democratic world work together, what are the best methods of collaboration? Probably they don't go through the existing institutions. We would need to think about what's an institution, a kind of coalition of the willing that includes, for example, all the countries that really do want to fight kleptocracy. And that's not everybody in the EU. That's not everybody. Certainly, it's not everybody in the UN. It's not everybody in NATO. It's not. You're going to need something different. You could imagine a group of 20 countries, not all from all around the world, actually, from including Asia and Africa and Latin America, who did really want to do it and who wanted to think about what laws work best and how do you block the proliferation of shell companies and how do you prevent your citizens from hiding their money in tax havens. You could imagine that as a group, but it wouldn't. There's no current institution that would do it for you. It would have to come from something new.
Yeah, on Clare? Certain topics there. To kind of give an advert for the Council of Europe, but certain topics, the Council of Europe even has that global reach because there's certain conventions and certain institutions like the Venice Commission, for example, which advises states, which has representatives from member states, and advises states on constitutional matters, rule of law, independence of judiciary. It is an open body, so it does have members from all over the world. As I say, there's various other treaties which are completely open conventions, and so are open to the world. And some of the monitoring also on corruption, some of the anti-corruption work we do, and so. But it's true. I think you maybe need a sort of a club like we've got this now European political community, but you need a kind of world community, which is a sort of world democracy world forum. Yeah.
Please go ahead, Kevin.
Can I just say something about this because, I know it's slightly off topic, but I can't resist the temptation to. One of the crucial questions, also when it comes to efforts to shore up the rule of law and shore up democracy, to fight against corruption and kleptocracy and all of it, a crucial question is what kind of world the Global South wants. Because I think countries in the global south have all sorts of reasons, legitimate reasons, to be wary and to be angry even about the current architecture of global governance. And then, they denounce it, on a regular basis in very strident terms, and rightfully so. The question is that I haven't heard, honestly, I might be wrong, but I haven't heard, India describe what kind of institutional architecture they want for the world. And I would think that this is one of the crucial questions going forward. Because, as we know, the power is shifting very visibly towards global south countries. And we don't know, what kind of multilateral mechanisms they want to put in place. What kind of multilateral mechanisms they would feel comfortable with.
Right.
I just think we should, I think we shouldn't be completely pessimistic. I mean, there is a need for leadership, but if you think about the institutions that were set up in the aftermath of the Second World War, which really was one of the darkest hours, especially in Europe, that we can possibly imagine, and out of that, all sorts of really important institutions were created, and maybe they're weaker now in the current, media, within a world of social media, in a world of political fragmentation and so forth. But we could do that again, or we could reinvigorate these institutions. And I do think it's important for the stakeholders and the governments and the civil society representatives who care about that really to commit to that and not to give up hope, and to really to keep fighting.
And I think on this piece of not giving up hope and being optimistic, I guess one thing I would want to bring back also is there is a lot of organizing, I think, at the very grassroots level. So I just spent a couple of days with the Grassroots Justice Network, which is a network of organizations doing incredible work at that very local level to make justice real to people in their daily lives. I just wonder where each of you maybe find hope or could point to something positive that we could perhaps lean into.
Oh, there's plenty, actually.
Okay, good.
I know, these conversations these days have a tendency, to becoming like group therapy, right? But
we might need some of that over coffee.
There's actually a lot of hope, and I'll give you. Don't take my word for it. At International Idea, we publish an annual report on the global state of democracy, right? Every year. And one of the things that we've been finding consistently over the past 4 or 5 years is that, there's a lot of problems with the way representative institutions are working, with the way rule of law is working, protections of rights are weakened all over the world, but the participation element of democracy remains remarkably robust all over the world. Less so when it comes to electoral participation, that has actually fallen significantly over the past 15 years, but civic activism. Civic activism remains extraordinarily robust. And this is something that we started seeing during the pandemic and has remained at very high level to this day. So I think, and if you ask me, I for reasons connected to my job, I travel all over the place and, have contact with, the counterparts that we work with, be it institutional or civil society partners. And I can tell you that the energy to revitalize, to renew the democratic project is today exclusively coming from civic actors. The institutional side of things when it comes to democracy is actually quite stale. It's civic activism that harbors the hope to revitalize the democratic project. That's what we're seeing, and the numbers appear to back it up.
Great, thanks so much.
Yeah, I actually find this question irritating.
Okay, fair enough.
I asked it a lot. What gives you hope? And
Right.
the idea that I'm sitting on a panel and I should give you hope
Yes.
seems somehow artificial. I mean, I think that hope comes from your own activity, and so people are always asking me, what can we do? I mean, it's, you should do what it is, you know your situation, you know what you're surrounded by. I mean, if you are someone who lives in an American state and you can become part of state politics, or you can join a party, or you can help a candidate or be a candidate, then that's what you should do. If you're a lawyer, then you should use your legal skills and talents to in the way that makes it possible. If you're a journalist or a politician, you should act in those ways. I mean, I feel that if people want hope, hope and optimism come from engagement. And so I'm not going to tell you how to be engaged, but I will tell you that if you are engaged, you will feel better.
Fair enough. No, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Claire?
So, well, I suppose it does come back to what I said at the beginning about the ebb and flow. And so you do see, we were really heading for this, because I work a lot on the execution of the European Court of Human Rights judgments, we were coming to a really total deadlock and total crisis with Poland about the rule of law judgments, and then and the Constitutional Court ruling saying that the ECHR didn't have jurisdiction. And then, magically there was an election and it all changed. And so it's just that things can change, can turn around even when you're feeling pretty desperate. Yeah.
Can I say something else
Yes, of
about
course.
this? And I will go back to something that I mentioned in passing. I mean, I think one source of hope is that we do have examples in which it has been possible to stop the tide
Yes.
of backsliding. As I said before, this is a protracted struggle. I mean, there's no final moment, there's no final victory. But there are examples. And that brings me to something that I think is very important to bear in mind, which is, also goes to your previous question of, when is it that we draw the line, so that we spring into action. This has become very messy because the process of demise of democracies these days is a very murky one, and you never quite know when the line, the Rubicon, has been crossed. Well, I'll give you a rule of thumb. To me, the rule of thumb is there's hope when political change through the ballot box is still possible.
Okay. Yeah.
That's the difference between India and Venezuela.
Yeah.
Hence, it is, again, vital that we protect the integrity of elections. As long as elections are able to bring about political change through the ballot box, there's hope.
Very helpful. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for going along with the question, even if it's annoying. I appreciate that. So I feel like we've really looked at kind of the macro, the big picture in terms of what the trends are, drilling down a bit into what's driving those trends, looking at a little bit the examples of places that have halted the trends and reversed them. And then we talked a lot here about also the individual capacity to make change, but then also some of the really problematic things blocking that around social media, other forces, the forces of various discourses of populism and just autocratization more generally. I think to kind of sum up a little bit and then move into what we'll have next, which is a video, the conversations that I've already been having over coffee have touched on all of these issues as well. And I feel like this space that we have and this energy that we're all bringing to this moment really can allow us to energize ourselves for the next steps. And I want to thank again the World Justice Project for bringing us together for this discussion. I think it's really important. And you may know that there is a World Justice Challenge that has been won by a number of organizations. And we're going to have the opportunity now to see a video that highlights the work of Pacto pela Democracia, which is one of the winners of the World Justice Challenge. And it'll show us a bit about their impactful work.
You might think Brazil's democracy is doing fine. We have elections, we change presidents, but that's not the whole story. We are a young democracy. I was born in the 80s. Brazil was just leaving a military dictatorship. And a couple of years ago, our former president spent years attacking our institutions. He discredited elections and spread disinformation. He threatened not to accept the results if they did not favor him. Alarmed that Brazilian democracy was at risk, we built a coalition and over 200 civil society groups joined. We called it Pacto pela Democracia, which means Pact for Democracy, and we united people who had never worked together before. And we worked to defend the integrity of our elections. We organized rallies, wrote open letters, held weekly strategy sessions, and we met with the courts, Congress, the press, even traveled abroad to build support. Our campaigns reached more than 30 million people. In 2022, on election day, we launched a Situation Room, 120 people from 30 organizations tracking voter access, security, and disinformation in real time. Elections are safe, but weeks later, our capital was attacked. To use a Brazilian football analogy, democracy had won the match, but not the championship. Our work is not over because next year we'll have elections again, and because democracy must be defended by movements like ours and allies like you. We are honored to have been recognized as a 2024 World Justice Challenge winner in the electoral processes category.
Great.
And with that, I just want to thank very much the wonderful panelists, Kevin and Claire. This has been a really wonderful conversation, and we look forward to taking it out into the coffee space and ultimately back to our home countries and into the streets if needed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.